Zuri sat in the dim corner of her small home in Addis Ababa, her arms wrapped tightly around her newborn daughter, Imani. The baby's soft breath was the only sound in the room, a fragile reminder that life still stirred within those cold walls. Outside, the wind howled through the cracks of the wooden shutters, carrying with it the bite of winter. Inside, cupboards stood bare, and the fire had long burned down to ashes. She tried to hum softly to calm Imani, but her voice trembled with exhaustion. Hunger gnawed at her, but she pushed it aside, focusing only on the tiny body pressed against her chest. Every cry from her child cut deeper into her heart, reminding her of all the things she could not give. Then came the moment she never imagined. Kwame, her husband, stood by the doorway with his coat already on. His eyes didn't meet hers. "I can't do this anymore," he said flatly, his voice sharp and cold. Before she could speak, before she could even beg, he turned and walked into the night. The silence he left behind was louder than his words. Zuri sat frozen, her mind spinning, unable to understand how he could walk away so easily. Fear crawled up her spine. How would she keep Imani warm? How would she feed her? Alone, with winter pressing harder against the fragile walls of her home, Zuri felt her world collapse. Yet in her arms Imani stirred, needing her still. Zuri lay awake with Imani pressed against her chest, listening to the baby's tiny breaths as if they were the only thing keeping her grounded. The room was still, but her mind was not. Again and again, her thoughts went back to Kwame, to the promises he had once made so easily. She remembered the way he had spoken to her before Imani was born, his voice full of certainty. "Don't worry, Zuri," he had said, resting a hand on her belly. "We will raise her together. I will always be here." She had believed him every word. She had held on to those promises like a lifeline, especially during the long months when her body ached and she wondered how she would manage motherhood. But now the memory felt cruel. The same lips that had spoken of forever had whispered, "I can't do this anymore," before he vanished into the night. She couldn't stop replaying those words, comparing them to the warmth of what he had once sworn to her. How could someone change so completely? How could a man who once held her hand with pride now leave her with nothing but silence and hunger? The world outside their home seemed to know her pain too. Neighbors glanced at her differently when she passed with Imani tied to her back. Some shook their heads, others whispered just loud enough for her to hear. Poor girl. Left with a baby. He ran off. Couldn't handle the responsibility. Their words were heavy, pressing down on her chest, adding shame to the loneliness she already carried. Even her own relatives, instead of offering comfort, hinted at blame. "Maybe you should have been more patient with him. Maybe you should ask him to come back." Every whisper was a knife. Each one made her question herself, as if she had failed as a wife, as a woman. In the quiet of the night, when Imani finally slept, Zuri's thoughts turned dangerous. Should she swallow her pride and go after him? Should she beg him to return, even if it meant living with a man who had already chosen to abandon her once? The thought made her stomach turn, yet the fear of raising a child alone in a world so harsh made her wonder if that was her only choice. But another voice rose inside her, small but steady. Why should she chase after someone who left her when she needed him most? Why should her daughter grow up seeing a mother bend and break just to keep a man near? This voice was softer than her fear, but it refused to disappear. It whispered to her that she deserved more, that Imani deserved more. Zuri sat by the dying fire, rocking her baby gently, torn between the old promises that haunted her and the bitter truth of her present. Her heart ached with betrayal, but inside that ache was also a question she could not ignore. Was this the end of her story, or the beginning of something she had yet to discover? The nights in Addis Ababa grew colder, and Zuri felt every bite of the winter wind seep through the cracks of her small home. She gathered whatever scraps of wood she could find, breaking even old stools and broken baskets to keep a small fire alive. The flames were weak, barely enough to push back the chill, but it was all she had. She held Imani close, wrapping her baby in thin cloths, pressing her own body around her like a shield. Imani's small hands searched for warmth and Zuri whispered, "I won't let the cold take you, my child." Though her voice wavered with doubt. Food became the next battle. The cupboards were empty, and each day Zuri's stomach growled louder, but she chose to ignore it. When she found a little grain, she cooked only enough porridge for Imani, spooning it slowly into the baby's tiny mouth. She would sit and watch, her own hunger twisting her insides, but she smiled anyway, pretending to be satisfied just seeing her daughter fed. Sometimes, when Imani finally fell asleep, Zuri pressed her hand to her stomach and whispered to herself, "Tomorrow I will eat," though tomorrow never seemed to bring enough. One afternoon, desperation pushed her out into the bitter wind. She tied Imani to her back and walked through the streets searching for anything. Scraps left in the market, a kind stranger, anything at all. Her legs shook from weakness and her head grew light. She hadn't eaten in 2 days and every step felt heavier than the last. At one point she stumbled, nearly falling to her knees. A passerby glanced her way but quickly turned his eyes, as if her suffering was too much to acknowledge. The shame of being unseen pressed harder than the hunger itself. Zuri leaned against a wall, clutching Imani tight. The baby stirred and whimpered, and that sound gave her strength to keep moving. Her vision blurred, and she could almost feel herself slipping away, but the thought of Imani crying alone in the cold snapped her back. She whispered, "No, not yet. I can't give up now." The winter showed no mercy. The nights grew longer, the winds sharper, and still she faced it all alone. Each day was a fight between her body's weakness and her heart's determination. Though she felt her strength fading, a fire still burned quietly inside her. A mother's resolve to survive, no matter what. For Imani's sake she pushed on, even when the world seemed ready to let her fall. The snow was falling harder that day, the kind that stung Zuri's face as she walked slowly with Imani tied to her back. Her steps were heavy, each one dragging as if her body no longer wanted to move. She had gone out searching for food again, though she already knew the market stalls would be nearly empty. People avoided looking at her, the tired woman clutching her child. She felt invisible yet exposed at the same time. It was then that Baraka noticed her. He was a traveling trader, carrying a small cart filled with goods, cloth, spices, a little food. He had seen many faces on his journeys, but something about the way Zuri walked stopped him. Her body swayed like she might fall at any moment, and yet she clung to her child as if the baby was the only thing anchoring her to the earth. Baraka did not speak right away. He slowed his cart, watching her carefully. When Zuri paused to catch her breath, he stepped closer and pulled a small piece of bread from his pack. Without a word, he held it out to her. Zuri's eyes flickered to the bread and then to his face. Her pride rose quickly, and her voice came out sharper than she intended. "I don't need charity." But even as she spoke, Imani stirred and whimpered against her back, her small cry cutting through Zuri's defenses. Her lips pressed tight, torn between her pride and her child's hunger. Baraka did not argue. He simply placed the bread on the edge of her cart and stepped back, as if to say the choice was hers. Something in his quietness disarmed her. Slowly, with trembling hands, she reached for it. She tore a small piece and pressed it into Imani's mouth, watching her baby suckle with relief. Zuri's eyes filled, though she quickly blinked the tears away. Then Baraka did something even more unexpected. From his cart, he pulled out a thick shawl, woven from warm wool. He held it out gently. "For the baby," he said softly. Zuri shook her head at first, clutching Imani closer. "We're fine," she whispered, though her shivering body told the truth. Again Baraka said nothing more. He draped the shawl over the edge of her shoulder and stepped back once again. She stood frozen, feeling the warmth of the fabric seep into her skin. Slowly, she pulled it tighter around Imani, wrapping her child in the softness. Her pride still ached, but her heart softened just enough to whisper, "Thank you." Baraka gave a small nod, as if he expected nothing in return. Then he turned back to his cart, ready to move on. Zuri watched him go, her mind spinning. She did not trust easily anymore, not after Kwame's betrayal. But something about this stranger felt different. For the first time in weeks, she felt a flicker of something she thought she had lost hope. In the days that followed, Zuri noticed small changes. At first she thought it was a trick of fate, but then she realized it was Baraka. Each morning when she opened her door, there would be something waiting. A bundle of bread wrapped in cloth, a handful of dried beans, or sometimes even a piece of firewood. He never knocked, never announced himself. The gifts were just there, quiet and steady, like the morning sun. At first Zuri's pride bristled. She told herself she didn't want pity. She even thought about leaving the food untouched. But then she would hear Imani cry with hunger, and her heart would break. Slowly she began to accept it, not for herself but for her child. Every time she cooked the beans or warmed her hands by the firewood, she found herself whispering a small prayer of thanks. One evening she caught him. Baraka was setting down a basket of eggs by her door when she stepped outside. He froze, almost embarrassed to be seen, but Zuri's eyes softened. "Why do you keep helping us?" she asked, her voice low, carrying both gratitude and suspicion. Baraka met her gaze without hesitation. "Because you're stronger than you think," he said. "I've watched you walk through the snow, carrying your child when your own legs could barely hold you. That is strength. Don't mistake hunger and cold for weakness." His words sank deep, cutting through the heavy fog of shame she had been carrying since Kwame left. No one had spoken to her like that, not her family, not her neighbors. They only whispered about her failure, about the man who had abandoned her. But here was this stranger, seeing something in her that she had almost forgotten herself. Zuri felt her throat tighten. She wanted to argue, to push away the kindness before it broke down the walls she had built. But when she looked at Imani wrapped in the shawl Baraka had given, she realized the truth. His help was not chains, it was relief. And his words were not empty. They were reminders that she had survived nights she thought would destroy her. That night, for the first time since Kwame walked out the door, Zuri felt something stir inside her. It wasn't joy, not yet. But it was lighter than despair, warmer than shame. It was the beginning of hope. She looked down at Imani, who gurgled softly in her sleep, and whispered, "We're going to be okay, my love." And deep inside she almost believed it. The winter had not ended, but something inside Zuri had begun to shift. With Baraka's quiet guidance, she started to see possibilities where before she had only seen walls. One morning, as he shared stories of his travels, he suggested she think about small trade. "You have skilled hands," he said. "What if you made baskets? People always need them." At first Zuri shook her head. "Who would buy from me? I have nothing." But Baraka only smiled. "You have more than you think. Start with one." His words stayed with her long after he left. That evening, after Imani fell asleep, Zuri gathered strips of old straw she had once used for mats. Slowly, clumsily, she began weaving. Her fingers remembered what her mother had taught her years ago, and by the time the fire dimmed, a small basket sat in her lap. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. The next week, with Baraka's help, she traded the basket for a little flour. The feeling of holding food in her hands, knowing it came from her own work, filled her with a pride she hadn't felt in months. Piece by piece she wove more. Some were crooked, some uneven, but each one was better than the last. Soon, neighbors who once pitied her began asking quietly if she had any for sale. Her hands grew stronger, and so did her spirit. Her home also began to change. With scraps of wood Baraka helped her find, she patched the holes in her hut, fixing the cracks where the wind once howled through. Each repair was small, but together they made the house warmer, safer. Zuri noticed the difference when Imani slept longer without shivering, her little chest rising and falling in peace. The biggest change, though, was inside her. The shame that once sat heavy on her shoulders started to lift. She no longer walked through the streets with her head bowed. She carried her baskets proudly, her baby tied to her back, her steps steady. She still felt the weight of loneliness sometimes, but it no longer crushed her. She was no longer just surviving, she was building. One afternoon, as she worked near the fire, Imani lay on a blanket beside her. Zuri looked down at her daughter, who suddenly let out a soft, bubbling laugh. It startled Zuri at first. Such a pure, unexpected sound in a house that had known only silence and tears. Her own laughter followed, spilling out before she could stop it. She scooped Imani into her arms, tears sliding down her face, but this time they were not from sorrow. Holding her child close, Zuri whispered, "We're really going to make it, aren't we?" For the first time since Kwame left, she truly believed it. The sound of Imani's laughter filled the room, mingling with the quiet crackle of the fire, and for Zuri, it felt like the beginning of a new life. It was a gray afternoon when Zuri heard a knock at the door. She wasn't expecting anyone. Baraka usually left food quietly and never disturbed her. When she opened it, her breath caught. Kwame stood there, his coat dusty, his face thinner than she remembered. but his eyes carried the same sharpness. "Well," he said, pushing past her into the room without waiting for an invitation. "I see you've managed without me." His voice was full of arrogance, as if he were the one who had been wronged. Zuri stood still, Imani tied to her back, her heart racing. Kwame walked around the small hut, noticing the patched walls, the baskets neatly stacked by the corner. "So this is how you live now? Taking help from strangers?" His tone dripped with mockery. "I heard about him, the traitor. Feeding you, clothing you. Is this what you've become, Zuri? A woman who can't survive without another man?" The words cut deep, but they didn't pierce her the way they once would have. Zuri lifted her chin. "I survived without you," she said firmly. "Everything you see here I built with my own hands. I kept our daughter alive when you walked away." Kwame laughed, but it was hollow. "Don't speak to me like that. I'm still your husband. This is still my family." He reached out as if to touch Imani, but Zuri stepped back, her arms tightening protectively around her child. "You lost that right the night you left us," she said, her voice steady, almost calm. Inside, her heart pounded, but she refused to let it show. "You abandoned me when the cold was at its worst, when our baby needed you most. You don't get to walk back in and claim us like nothing happened." Kwame's eyes narrowed. He wasn't used to this Zuri, the one who didn't tremble, the one who didn't beg. "You think you're strong now because some traitor showed you pity? Don't fool yourself. You'll come crawling back to me." Zuri shook her head slowly. "No, Kwame. I don't crawl anymore. I stand." The words felt like fire on her tongue, burning away the last pieces of the weak woman she used to be. The room fell into silence. Kwame stared at her, searching for the woman he once controlled with promises and fear. But she was gone. Before him stood someone new. A mother who had fought hunger, cold, and loneliness and had come out stronger. Finally, he muttered something under his breath and turned toward the door. His steps were heavy, his pride wounded, but Zuri didn't call after him. She held Imani close, her voice soft but unshaken as she whispered to her daughter, "We don't belong to him anymore." For the first time, Kwame seemed to realize the truth. Zuri was no longer his to claim. She had become her own strength, her own shelter, and she would never go back. The news of Kwame's return, and the way Zuri had stood up to him, spread quickly through the neighborhood. In a place where whispers carried faster than the wind, everyone soon knew that the man who abandoned his wife and newborn had come back demanding his family, only to be refused. For once, the whispers weren't filled with pity for Zuri. They carried something new, something sharper: respect. Women who had once looked at her with sympathy or judgment now looked differently. They remembered how they had seen her walk through the snow with Imani tied to her back, weak but unbroken. They recalled how she had started weaving baskets when everyone thought she would collapse. Quietly, they began to admire her. Some even came to her door, not to gossip, but to ask how she had learned to weave so quickly, how she had managed to keep going when everything seemed lost. One woman, clutching her own baby, whispered, "You give us courage. If you can do this alone, maybe we can too." The men in the community were slower to change, but even they could not ignore what they saw. Kwame had left in the hardest winter. Yet Zuri had survived. Not only survived, but rebuilt her home, fed her child, and created a trade that brought value to the market. Men who once shook their heads at her misfortune now nodded when she passed. Some even came to buy her baskets, their voices carrying a hint of respect they had never offered before. What surprised Zuri most was the way people began to defend her. When Kwame tried to stir anger, mocking her in public and accusing her of dishonor for accepting Baraka's help, others stepped in. "You don't get to shame her," one neighbor told him sharply. "She did what you could not," she stayed. For the first time, Zuri did not have to carry the weight of his words alone. The community itself had seen the truth. Zuri felt the shift deep inside her. The shame that had once followed her like a shadow began to fade. She walked through the market no longer with bowed head, but upright, her daughter on her back and baskets in her hands. People no longer saw her as the woman abandoned, but as the woman who endured. She realized something powerful. She had not only rebuilt her own life, she had changed the way others saw what was possible. Late one evening, as she sat outside with Imani in her lap, she watched a group of young women laughing together. Their eyes flickered toward her, and instead of pity there was pride. Zuri smiled softly to herself. The same neighbors who once doubted her now carried her story as a reminder of strength. She was no longer the broken wife of Kwame. She was Zuri, the survivor, the mother who had faced the coldest winter and kept the fire burning. And everyone knew it. Life slowly began to take on a different rhythm for Zuri. The heaviness that once filled her days was still there in pieces, but it no longer defined her. Baraka's quiet presence had become part of her life, not as someone who tried to take Kwame's place, but as someone who walked beside her. He never demanded, never pressed. He simply showed up when needed, offering guidance, laughter, or silence, whichever she needed most. Their bond grew not in grand moments but in the small, steady ones. When Zuri struggled to carry firewood, Baraka lifted part of the load without a word. When she stayed up late weaving baskets, he would sit nearby, mending his cart or telling stories from his travels. Imani grew used to his voice, her eyes lighting up when he entered the room. One day, she even reached her small arms toward him, and though Zuri's chest tightened for a moment, she found herself smiling. It wasn't fear, it was trust. Baraka never tried to take control of her work, but he taught her how to expand it. If you sell only in this street, you'll always be limited, he explained one morning. But if I carry your baskets with me when I travel, more people will see them. It was a simple suggestion, but it opened a new door. Soon, her baskets began to reach towns she had never visited. Traders brought back coins, sometimes even goods to trade. For the first time, Zuri's home had more than just survival, it had stability. She began to dream again. With her earnings, she bought better materials, stronger straw that made her baskets last longer. She started repairing not just her walls but her roof. Slowly, the little hut that once felt like a prison of hunger began to look like a place of comfort. Zuri even set aside a corner of the room just for Imani, laying down soft cloths and hanging a small charm above her space for protection. At night, when the fire glowed warmly and Imani slept peacefully, Zuri allowed herself to imagine the future. She pictured Imani walking to school one day, her feet steady, her laughter filling the air. She imagined her daughter growing up proud, knowing her mother had chosen strength instead of despair. The thought brought tears to her eyes, but this time they were tears of hope. Baraka noticed her quiet moments but never interrupted them. Instead, he reminded her gently, "You are the reason she will have that future, Zuri. Don't forget that." His words were steady, not flattery but truth. And deep down, Zuri began to believe it. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, Zuri didn't feel like she was walking it alone. She had her daughter in her arms, her work in her hands, and beside her, a man who respected her strength rather than trying to control it. A new life was beginning, and it was hers to build. The long winter finally began to loosen its grip. The snow that once covered everything in silence now melted into streams that trickled down the streets. The air no longer bit at Zuri's skin. Instead, it carried a soft warmth, the promise of new life. Trees that had stood bare for months began to show small buds, fragile but full of hope. Zuri stood outside her hut, Imani resting against her chest. The baby's eyes were wide, catching the brightness of the changing world. Zuri's gaze swept across the thawing land, and for the first time in a long while, she felt no fear of tomorrow. She remembered the nights when she thought she would not survive, when the cold and hunger had nearly swallowed her whole. She remembered Kwame's harsh words as he walked away, leaving her in the darkest season of her life. And yet, here she was, standing tall, her child alive and smiling in her arms. Baraka's kindness had been the spark that kept her moving, but the strength she carried now came from within. Every basket she wove, every fire she built, every tear she dried had shaped her into someone she never thought she could be. Looking down at Imani, Zuri whispered the words she had carried in her heart. Abandonment was not my end, it was my beginning. The wind shifted, soft and gentle, brushing against her face like a blessing. Behind her was the cold winter that had tried to break her. Ahead of her stretched a season of growth and new chances. Holding Imani close, Zuri stepped forward, ready to walk into the future she had built with her own hands, stronger, braver, and full of hope.